Hey class, this is Tom with your first mini lesson. We're going to talk about employing sound science. In chapter 1, when we read about environmental science, they talked about the scientific method. That is critical if you get into the professional realm of this area in any science, that you want to have your studies accepted. And the only way you're going to get them accepted is if you employ sound science. So in each one of our mini lessons, I hope to point to something that is or is not sound science based on information provided to us or generated by us. So let's look at this scenario. If we were asked a question about an ecosystem, and if you took away one factor, how would it be impacted? How would we answer that question? Well, we've learned in Unit 1 that there are a multitude of biotic and abiotic factors affecting ecosystems. So there's really not one answer to this question. So what we need to do is studies that are conducted to look at a specific area of an ecosystem, and then we move on from there. And if you can join together enough studies, then maybe you can make more holistic conclusions about certain types of ecosystems. So as I said, studies that employ sound scientific principles, we're going to have to be unbiased, which is difficult in today's political climate. We're going to have to be fair and factual. So if we stick to those principles, there's a better chance that you'll be following the scientific method fairly and factually, and your study will be accepted. So here's a scenario for you. You work for an environmental consulting company. It's been hired to perform an environmental impact statement on behalf of an energy company is proposing to install a network of wells to extract natural gas. Environmentalists argue that the ecosystem will be damaged by this project, as its infrastructure will intersect the elk migration pathways. Your part of the EIS is to manage the production of a report. It's going to address the potential impact on the elk population and what effect such population changes may have on the ecosystem. And what can we do about it? Are there any viable remedial measures? Since your company doesn't have a wildlife specialist on hand, you're going to need to accept proposals and select one. So let's look at some of those proposals. The first proposal is very simple. The literature search that's proposed is basically the bulk of the study. And you'll note that there's some generalizations here. Elk have several different species that I don't know that it's appropriate to look at just one broad elk population and say that is applicable to all elk populations. But nevertheless, in this study, what they want to do is average the migration distances of elk in general and come to a conclusion as to whether or not that average migration distance will be within the study area. If so, their conclusion would be that there's no problem. So this cost for the study would be about $25,000 and delivered in about 2 months of authorization. So why did I put these factors in here? And I've got 4 proposals for you. Each one of them shows a cost and a time of delivery of the report. Even though the opening scenario says that each one of these proposals is within time and within budget, sometimes we look at these factors and whether or not they should be employed in our decision. And that's where we can tend to get away from the scientific method and perhaps lose our focus. So we'll talk a little bit more about that later. So let's look at the second proposal. So this broadens the proposal a bit by saying that not only will they look at the potential impact on the elk population, but we'll look at several specific elk populations, right, specific to the region, and they will supplement this literature search with field observations from the project area. So we're getting real data from the site itself. Then they expand to go on to the driving factors behind why the elk are choosing such distance to migrate. Is it food? Is it shelter? Is it for water. There are a number of reasons why elk migrate. And then they go on to say they will evaluate what alternatives may exist for the elk. If they might just change their migration pattern, could they still get their food, water, and shelter? And finally, it will evaluate the significance of the alternatives on the elk population. Cost of this study, $75,000, and about a year to get it to the client. So, if you look at the first and second proposals, what questions are they not answering for the client? The client wasn't overly concerned with a change in the elk population, but his bottom line was what impact would any such change have on the ecosystem? And if there were a significant impact on the ecosystem, could it be remedied? So neither Proposal 1 nor Proposal 2 answer those last two questions. So let's look at the third proposal here. This is the same as the second, except they add a final bullet here, which says it will evaluate the potential impacts of any decrease in the elk population on the health of the ecosystem. And that is a key component to what the client is looking for. If the population decreases, how will that impact the ecosystem? And in our studies, there were plenty of examples in all the reading material you were given on what impacts you can have, and the term trophic cascading came to be. We can talk more about that. So the final proposal is the same as the third, except it adds a final bullet. It says evaluate if there are any remedial measures that could timely and cost effectively address any potentially negative impacts on the ecosystem in the project and surrounding areas. So you would have to assume that there were discussions with the client to identify what does he mean by timely and cost effectively, so that the consultant could propose something that met those objectives. So indeed, if there were a decrease in elk population, is there something that could be done to mitigate that loss? Or is anything needed at all? If you recall in your readings about Yellowstone Park, the wolf was eradicated, I believe it was the 20s or 30s, and we saw a spike in the elk population. The elk population grazes on willow, so the population of willow decreased. The beavers rely on the willow as they use it for their dams. So there was a decrease in the population of beaver. So the biodiversity of the ecosystem in Yellowstone Park took a hit when the wolf was eradicated. So what would be the impact if the elk population was reduced? We don't know until we do the study, but there could be mitigating factors to remedy the situation. Perhaps, you could speculate on what that may be, but you could perhaps decrease some of the predators. It depends. It's a balance. And what ecologists constantly are fighting with is, if I change one part of the food web, how will that affect the other? And sometimes there's unforeseen circumstances, so it takes a lot of study and a lot of certainty before such decisions are made. Okay, feel free to respond to the survey I posted to see if we want to talk about this live as a group, or if you prefer, we can talk during office hours. Just check the syllabus, and my hours and methods of contact are noted there. I'll talk to you soon.